What if I told you that the difference between people who constantly struggle with decisions and those who seem to effortlessly navigate any challenge isn't intelligence, education, or even experience? The real difference is that some people have trained their brains to think strategically, while others are trapped in reactive thinking patterns that keep them stuck. Every single day, you make hundreds of decisions. From the moment you wake up to the time you go to sleep, your brain is constantly processing information, evaluating options, and choosing paths forward. But here's the problem. Most people are making these decisions with an untrained mind. They're using mental shortcuts, falling for cognitive traps, and following emotional impulses instead of logical analysis. The result? Poor decisions that compound over time, missed opportunities, and a constant feeling of being one step behind. But what if there was a way to completely rewire how your brain approaches problems? What if you could develop the same type of strategic thinking that allows chess grandmasters to see 20 moves ahead, or that enables successful entrepreneurs to spot opportunities that others miss entirely? That's exactly what we're going to explore today. You're about to discover the hidden science behind strategic thinking. Learn how to identify and eliminate the mental biases that cloud your judgment and master the cognitive tools that will allow you to outsmart virtually any situation you encounter. This isn't about becoming more intelligent in the traditional sense. This is about becoming more strategic, more analytical, and more effective in how you process information and make decisions. By the end of this journey, you'll have a completely different relationship with problems and challenges. Instead of feeling overwhelmed or uncertain, you'll approach each situation with confidence, knowing that you have the mental tools to break it down, analyze it thoroughly, and find the optimal solution. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Strategic Intelligence. Most people go through life playing mental checkers, while a select few are playing chess. The difference isn't talent or luck, it's approach. Strategic intelligence is the ability to see patterns where others see chaos, to anticipate outcomes before they manifest, and to position yourself advantageously in any situation. But here's what most people misunderstand about strategic thinking. It's not about being naturally smart or having some innate gift for analysis. Strategic intelligence is a trained skill, and like any skill, it can be developed through understanding the right principles and practicing the correct techniques. The foundation of strategic intelligence rests on 4 core pillars. The first pillar is systems thinking. This means understanding that everything is connected to everything else. When most people look at a problem, they see an isolated event. Strategic thinkers see an entire ecosystem of causes, effects, and interconnected relationships. For example, when a business starts losing customers, most people might blame the sales team or the product quality. A strategic thinker would examine the entire system, market conditions, competitor actions, internal processes, customer feedback loops, employee morale, supply chain issues, and even broader economic trends. They understand that the visible problem is usually just a symptom of deeper systemic issues. The second pillar is temporal thinking, which is the ability to think across different time horizons simultaneously. Strategic thinkers don't just focus on immediate results. They constantly evaluate how current decisions will impact outcomes in 6 months, 2 years, or even a decade from now. They understand that the most important consequences of any decision often don't appear immediately. This temporal perspective allows them to make decisions that might seem suboptimal in the short term but create massive advantages over time. Warren Buffett exemplifies this perfectly when he holds stocks for decades while others are focused on quarterly returns. He's optimizing for a completely different time horizon, and that's what gives him his edge. The third pillar is probabilistic thinking. Instead of thinking in absolutes, strategic thinkers think in probabilities and ranges of outcomes. They don't ask, "Will this work?" They ask, "What's the probability this will work? And what are the potential ranges of outcomes?" This allows them to make better decisions under uncertainty and to prepare for multiple scenarios simultaneously. When Jeff Bezos decided to start Amazon, he didn't know it would become one of the world's largest companies. But he calculated that there was a high probability that internet commerce would grow significantly. And he positioned himself to capture value from that trend, regardless of the specific outcome. The fourth pillar is leverage thinking. Strategic thinkers are constantly looking for points of maximum leverage, where small inputs can create disproportionately large outputs. They understand that not all actions are created equal, and they focus their energy on the few activities that can create the biggest impact. This is why strategic thinkers often seem to accomplish more with less effort. They're not working harder. They're working on higher leverage activities. They might spend weeks thinking through a decision that will save them months of execution time later. But developing strategic intelligence requires more than just understanding these concepts intellectually. You need to rewire your brain's default thinking patterns. Most people's brains are optimized for survival in immediate, physical environments. We're programmed to react quickly to threats, to conserve energy, and to stick with familiar patterns. These evolved mental shortcuts served our ancestors well when they were avoiding predators on the savannah, but they're poorly suited for navigating complex modern challenges. Strategic intelligence requires us to override these default patterns and train our brains to think more deliberately and systematically. The process begins with developing metacognitive awareness, which means becoming conscious of how you think. Most people are completely unconscious of their thought processes. They have thoughts, but they don't observe themselves thinking. Strategic thinkers develop the ability to step outside their own mental processes and observe them objectively. This allows them to catch themselves when they're falling into mental traps, to recognize when their emotions are clouding their judgment, and to deliberately choose more effective thinking strategies. It's like developing an internal observer who can monitor and guide your thought processes in real time. The next step is building cognitive flexibility. This is the ability to shift between different thinking modes depending on what the situation requires. Sometimes you need to think analytically and break down complex problems into component parts. Other times, you need to think synthetically and see how disparate elements connect into larger patterns. Strategic thinkers develop a toolkit of different thinking approaches and become skilled at selecting the right tool for each situation. They might use systematic analysis for technical problems, creative brainstorming for innovation challenges, and game-theoretic thinking for competitive situations. Finally, strategic intelligence requires developing what psychologists call intellectual humility. This is the recognition that your initial understanding of any situation is likely incomplete or incorrect, and that effective thinking requires constantly updating your beliefs based on new evidence. Most people suffer from overconfidence bias. They believe their first impression is accurate and look for evidence to confirm their initial judgment. Strategic thinkers assume their first impression is probably wrong and actively look for evidence that contradicts their initial assessment. This intellectual humility is what allows strategic thinkers to adapt and improve continuously. They're not attached to being right. They're attached to finding better solutions. They view changing their mind as a sign of intellectual strength, not weakness. When you combine systems thinking, temporal thinking, probabilistic thinking, and leverage thinking with metacognitive awareness, cognitive flexibility, and intellectual humility, you create a foundation for strategic intelligence that can be applied to virtually any domain of life. Chapter 2. Breaking free from mental autopilot. Your brain is designed to be lazy. That might sound harsh, but it's actually a feature, not a bug. The human brain consumes about 20% of your body's total energy, despite being only 2% of your body weight. To conserve this precious energy, your brain has evolved to automate as many processes as possible, creating mental shortcuts and habitual patterns that require minimal conscious effort. These mental shortcuts, called heuristics, are incredibly useful for routine tasks. You don't want to consciously analyze every step of walking, driving a familiar route, or brushing your teeth. But the same energy-saving mechanisms that make routine tasks effortless also trap you in autopilot thinking when you encounter complex challenges that require careful analysis. Mental autopilot manifests in several destructive ways. The first is pattern matching without context analysis. When you encounter a new situation, your brain immediately searches for familiar patterns and tries to apply previously successful solutions. This works well when the new situation truly matches previous experiences, but it fails catastrophically when surface similarities mask fundamental differences. For example, many business leaders who succeeded in stable markets fail when conditions become volatile because they keep applying strategies that worked in the past without recognizing that the underlying dynamics have changed. They're pattern matching without updating for new contexts. The second manifestation is emotional hijacking. When you encounter stress, uncertainty, or conflict, primitive parts of your brain designed for physical survival take over from the more sophisticated regions responsible for strategic thinking. Your nervous system floods with stress hormones that impair working memory, reduce cognitive flexibility, and narrow your attention to immediate threats. This is why people often make their worst decisions when the stakes are highest. The pressure of important decisions triggers the exact mental state that's least conducive to good decision-making. Breaking free from autopilot requires learning to recognize these emotional hijacking episodes and developing techniques to restore clear thinking. The third manifestation is cognitive conservatism, which is the tendency to stick with familiar approaches even when they're no longer optimal. Your brain treats new approaches as risky because they require energy and attention, while familiar approaches feel safe because they've been successful before. This bias toward the familiar keeps people trapped in suboptimal patterns long after better alternatives become available. It's why organizations often resist innovation, why individuals stay in unsatisfying situations, and why entire industries can be disrupted by outsiders who aren't constrained by traditional thinking. Breaking free from mental autopilot requires developing what neuroscientists call cognitive control. This is your ability to consciously direct your attention, override automatic responses, and choose more deliberate thinking strategies. Think of it as developing a mental override system that can take control when your default patterns aren't serving you. The first step in developing cognitive control is creating trigger recognition systems. These are mental alerts that help you recognize when you're operating on autopilot and need to shift into more deliberate thinking. Some common triggers include feeling stuck on a problem, experiencing strong emotional reactions, noticing that you're applying familiar solutions without analysis, or realizing that you're avoiding difficult decisions. When you notice these triggers, the next step is implementing what psychologists call cognitive debiasing techniques. These are specific mental exercises designed to counteract your brain's automatic shortcuts and restore clear thinking. One powerful technique is the outside view method. When you're analyzing a situation, instead of focusing on the specific details that make your situation feel unique, you step back and ask, what typically happens in situations like this? This forces you to consider base rates and statistical patterns rather than getting lost in the details that make your situation feel special. Another essential technique is prospective hindsight, also known as the pre-mortem. Instead of trying to predict what will go right, you imagine that your plan has failed spectacularly and work backward to identify what could have caused the failure. This technique is remarkably effective at revealing blind spots and potential problems that normal planning processes miss. A third critical technique is consider the opposite. Whenever you form a strong opinion or reach a confident conclusion, you deliberately generate arguments for the opposite position. This isn't about becoming indecisive or losing confidence in your judgment. It's about stress testing your thinking and ensuring that your conclusions can withstand scrutiny. But perhaps the most important cognitive debiasing technique is developing what researchers call intellectual empathy. This is the ability to genuinely understand perspectives that differ from your own, not just superficially, but at a deep level, where you can see how reasonable people might reach different conclusions. Intellectual empathy requires you to suppress your natural tendency to judge other perspectives as wrong or inferior, and instead work to understand the logic and evidence that supports different viewpoints. This doesn't mean becoming relativistic or believing that all opinions are equally valid. It means becoming more sophisticated in your analysis by understanding the full landscape of reasonable positions. Developing cognitive control also requires building better emotional regulation skills. Since emotional hijacking is one of the primary ways that autopilot thinking takes over, learning to manage your emotional state is crucial for maintaining clear thinking under pressure. One of the most effective emotional regulation techniques is cognitive reappraisal, which involves changing how you interpret challenging situations. Instead of viewing obstacles as threats to be avoided, you can reframe them as puzzles to be solved or opportunities to develop new capabilities. This reframing isn't about positive thinking or denying reality. It's about choosing interpretations that promote clear thinking rather than emotional reactivity. When you view a challenge as a threat, your brain activates fight-or-flight responses that impair analytical thinking. When you view the same challenge as an interesting problem, your brain activates curiosity and exploration systems that enhance cognitive performance. Another powerful emotional regulation technique is temporal distancing. When you're experiencing strong emotions about a situation, you ask yourself how you'll feel about this situation in 10 years, or how someone from a different culture or time period might view it. This perspective shift helps reduce emotional intensity and restore analytical thinking. The goal isn't to eliminate emotions from decision-making entirely. Emotions provide valuable information about your values, preferences, and intuitive assessments. The goal is to prevent emotions from overwhelming your analytical capabilities so that you can integrate emotional and rational information effectively. Breaking free from mental autopilot is an ongoing process, not a one-time achievement. Your brain will always have a tendency to revert to automatic patterns, especially under stress or time pressure. The key is developing the awareness to recognize when you're operating on autopilot and the tools to shift into more deliberate thinking when the situation requires it. Chapter 3. Recognizing and defeating cognitive biases. Your brain lies to you constantly, and it does so in predictable ways. These lies aren't intentional deceptions. They're systematic errors in thinking called cognitive biases. Understanding these biases is crucial because they don't just affect other people's thinking, they affect your thinking too. And they're often strongest precisely when you think you're being most rational. Cognitive biases exist because your brain is trying to solve an impossible problem, making sense of an infinitely complex world with limited time, attention, and processing power. To handle this challenge, your brain has developed shortcuts that work reasonably well in many situations, but fail systematically in others. The first major category of cognitive biases involves how you process information. Confirmation bias is perhaps the most dangerous of these. Once you form an initial opinion about something, your brain automatically filters new information to support that opinion, while ignoring or dismissing contradictory evidence. This happens even when you're consciously trying to be objective. Your brain literally doesn't see information that contradicts your existing beliefs, or it interprets ambiguous information in ways that support your preconceptions. This is why intelligent, well-educated people can hold completely contradictory views about the same facts. Confirmation bias is particularly destructive because it creates the illusion of validation. The more you research a topic, the more evidence you find for your initial position, which makes you increasingly confident that you're right. You don't realize that you're only seeing evidence that supports your view because your brain is filtering out everything else. Closely related to confirmation bias is the availability heuristic, which causes you to judge the probability of events based on how easily you can remember examples. If you can quickly recall instances of something happening, your brain assumes it happens frequently. If you can't easily remember examples, your brain assumes it's rare. This leads to systematic distortions in risk assessment. People overestimate the danger of dramatic but rare events like plane crashes or terrorist attacks because these events are highly memorable and frequently reported in media. Meanwhile, they underestimate the risk of common but mundane dangers like heart disease or car accidents because these don't create vivid, memorable impressions. The availability heuristic also affects how you evaluate your own performance and potential. If you can easily remember your failures, you'll underestimate your abilities. If you can easily remember your successes, you'll overestimate them. Your self-assessment becomes a function of memory accessibility rather than actual performance patterns. Another critical information processing bias is anchoring, which occurs when the first piece of information you encounter about a topic disproportionately influences all subsequent judgments. Even when you know that initial information is irrelevant or unreliable, it still affects your thinking. Anchoring explains why negotiation tactics like making extreme initial offers are so effective, why first impressions are so powerful, and why it's so difficult to update your opinions even when you encounter compelling contradictory evidence. Your brain treats the first information as a reference point and then makes adjustments from there. But these adjustments are typically insufficient. The second major category of cognitive biases involves how you make predictions and assess probabilities. The planning fallacy causes you to systematically underestimate how long projects will take and overestimate how likely you are to achieve optimistic outcomes. This happens even when you have extensive experience with similar projects that took longer than expected. The planning fallacy occurs because when you're making predictions about your own projects, you focus on the specific plan you've developed and imagine everything going according to that plan. You don't adequately consider the reference class of similar projects and their actual outcomes, nor do you sufficiently account for unexpected complications and delays. This bias affects everything from personal goal setting to major business and government projects. It's why software development projects routinely exceed their timelines, why construction projects go over budget, and why people consistently fail to achieve their personal improvement goals on the timelines they set. Related to the planning fallacy is overconfidence bias, which causes you to overestimate the accuracy of your judgments and predictions. When asked to provide confidence intervals for estimates, most people provide ranges that are far too narrow. Events that they think have a 5% chance of occurring actually happen about 20 to 30% of the time. Overconfidence bias is particularly dangerous for complex decisions because it prevents you from adequately preparing for scenarios where your primary plan doesn't work. If you're overconfident about your predictions, you won't invest enough effort in contingency planning or risk management. The third major category involves social and motivational biases. Self-serving bias causes you to interpret information in ways that support your self-image and interests. When good things happen to you, you attribute them to your skill and effort. When bad things happen, you attribute them to external factors beyond your control. This bias extends beyond personal outcomes to affect how you evaluate ideas, opportunities, and other people. You're more likely to believe information that makes you look good or supports positions you've already taken publicly. You're more likely to dismiss information that threatens your status or requires you to admit mistakes. Attribution bias affects how you interpret other people's behavior. When someone else makes a mistake, you're likely to attribute it to their character flaws or incompetence. When you make the same mistake, you're likely to attribute it to external circumstances or bad luck. This asymmetry in attribution makes it difficult to learn from others' experiences or to evaluate your own performance accurately. Perhaps the most insidious cognitive bias is the bias blind spot, which is your tendency to recognize cognitive biases in other people while remaining blind to the same biases in your own thinking. The more you learn about cognitive biases, the more confident you become that you can avoid them. But this confidence is largely misplaced. Studies consistently show that even people with extensive training in cognitive biases continue to fall victim to them in their own decision-making. Knowledge of biases provides some protection, but it's not sufficient. You need specific techniques and systems to counteract these biases consistently. The first line of defense against cognitive biases is developing better decision-making processes. Instead of relying on your intuitive judgment, you create systematic approaches that force you to consider alternative perspectives and gather contradictory evidence. One powerful technique is red team analysis, where you deliberately assign someone to argue against your preferred position and poke holes in your reasoning. This can be a formal process with other people, or you can do it yourself by consciously adopting a skeptical perspective toward your own ideas. Another essential technique is base rate analysis. Before making predictions about specific situations, you research what typically happens in similar situations. This helps counteract overconfidence and planning fallacy by grounding your predictions in empirical data rather than optimistic scenarios. Reference class forecasting involves identifying a broad class of similar projects or decisions and using the statistical distribution of outcomes in that reference class to calibrate your expectations. Instead of asking, "How long will my project take?" you ask, "How long do projects like this typically take?" And then consider what makes your project likely to be faster or slower than average. For complex decisions, you can use structured decision-making frameworks like decision trees or weighted scoring models. These frameworks force you to explicitly identify your assumptions, quantify your judgments, and consider multiple factors systematically, rather than relying on intuitive overall impressions. Perhaps most importantly, you need to cultivate intellectual humility about the reliability of your own thinking. The goal isn't to become paralyzed by doubt or to lose confidence in your judgment. The goal is to maintain appropriate confidence calibrated to the actual reliability of your thinking in different situations. This means being highly confident about things you truly know well, while maintaining much more uncertainty about complex, novel, or emotionally charged situations where cognitive biases are most likely to affect your thinking. Chapter 4. The Power of Mental Models. Mental models are perhaps the most powerful tools in strategic thinking. Yet most people go through life using only a handful of these cognitive frameworks without even realizing it. A mental model is essentially a simplified representation of how something works. It's a thinking tool that helps you understand, predict, and navigate complex situations by providing structure for your analysis. The extraordinary power of mental models lies in their ability to transfer insights across domains. When you truly understand a mental model, you can apply it to situations far beyond where you originally learned it. This is why polymaths and strategic thinkers often seem to have insights that specialists miss. They're applying mental models from different fields to illuminate new aspects of problems. Consider the mental model of compound interest, which most people understand only in financial contexts. But compound interest applies to any situation where small, consistent actions create exponential results over time. Learning compounds when you build knowledge on previous knowledge. Relationships compound when trust builds on previous positive interactions. Skills compound when new capabilities build on existing foundations. Understanding compound interest as a general mental model helps you recognize these patterns across all areas of life and make better decisions about where to invest your time and attention. You start looking for opportunities to create compound effects rather than just linear improvements. The first category of essential mental models involves understanding systems and feedback loops. The most fundamental of these is the concept of feedback loops themselves. A feedback loop occurs when the outputs of a system are routed back as inputs, creating a loop of cause and effect. Positive feedback loops amplify changes, creating exponential growth or decline. When a company's success allows it to attract better talent, which leads to better products, which leads to more success, that's a positive feedback loop. When a person's lack of confidence leads to poor performance, which leads to more self-doubt, which leads to worse performance, that's also a positive feedback loop, but in a destructive direction. Negative feedback loops create stability by counteracting changes. When you feel cold, you shiver to generate heat, which warms you up, which reduces the shivering. When a market price gets too high, demand decreases, which causes the price to fall back down. Understanding feedback loops helps you identify why some problems persist despite your efforts to solve them, why some strategies create unexpectedly dramatic results, and how to design interventions that work with natural system dynamics rather than against them. Another crucial systems model is the concept of leverage points. These are places within a system where small changes can produce big impacts. Most people focus on changing parameters within systems, trying to work harder or do more of what they're already doing. But higher leverage comes from changing the structure of systems, the goals of systems, or the paradigms that create systems. For example, if you're trying to improve your health, you could focus on the parameter level by exercising more or eating better. But higher leverage might come from changing your environment to make healthy choices easier, or changing your identity to see yourself as someone who naturally makes healthy choices. The second category involves mental models for decision-making under uncertainty. Probabilistic thinking is the foundation of this category. Instead of thinking in terms of certainties, you think in terms of probability distributions and expected values. This doesn't mean you need to assign precise numerical probabilities to everything. It means developing intuitive appreciation for concepts like uncertainty, variance, and expected outcomes. When you're considering a job opportunity, instead of asking, "Is this a good opportunity?" you ask, "What's the range of possible outcomes? What's the probability of each outcome? And what's the expected value, considering both upside potential and downside risk?" Expected value thinking helps you make better decisions when outcomes are uncertain. You multiply the probability of each possible outcome by its value and sum these products. An opportunity with a 90% chance of modest success might be less attractive than an opportunity with a 30% chance of extraordinary success, depending on the specific payoffs involved. Closely related is the concept of optionality, which involves creating situations where you have the right, but not the obligation to take advantage of future opportunities. Options are valuable because they provide upside potential while limiting downside risk. In career terms, developing diverse skills creates optionality because it gives you more choices about how to respond to changing market conditions. In business, maintaining financial reserves creates optionality because it allows you to invest in unexpected opportunities or survive unexpected challenges. The third category involves mental models for understanding human behavior and social dynamics. One of the most powerful is the concept of incentives. People respond to incentives, often in ways that weren't intended by the people who designed the incentive systems. If you want to understand why people behave the way they do, don't listen to what they say their motivations are. Look at what behaviors are actually rewarded and punished in their environment. If a company says it values innovation but only promotes people who avoid risks, employees will learn to avoid risks regardless of the company's stated values. Understanding incentives helps you predict how people will respond to changes in policies, rules, or circumstances. It also helps you design better systems by ensuring that the incentives align with the outcomes you actually want. Another crucial behavioral model is the concept of social proof. People use other people's behavior as a guide for their own behavior, especially in uncertain situations. When you're not sure what to do, you look around to see what others are doing and follow their lead. Social proof explains why fashions spread, why financial bubbles form, and why bystander effects occur. It also explains why testimonials are so powerful in marketing and why creating visible examples of desired behavior is often more effective than just telling people what to do. The fourth category involves mental models for learning and adaptation. The concept of first principles thinking involves breaking down complex problems into their most fundamental components and reasoning up from there. Rather than reasoning by analogy or convention, most thinking is reasoning by analogy. You encounter a new situation and ask, "What does this remind me of?" Then you apply solutions that worked in the analogous situation. This works well when the analogy is accurate, but it fails when surface similarities mask fundamental differences. First principles thinking requires you to ask, what are the basic laws and constraints that govern this situation, rather than what has worked in similar situations. This approach often reveals possibilities that analogical thinking misses because it's not constrained by existing solutions. Elon Musk famously applied first principles thinking to rocket design. Instead of accepting the conventional wisdom that rockets are expensive, he asked what rockets are actually made of and how much those materials should cost. This led to breakthrough innovations in rocket reusability that dramatically reduced launch costs. Another powerful learning model is the concept of mental simulation. Instead of just analyzing situations abstractly, you run detailed simulations in your mind, imagining how different scenarios might unfold over time. This helps you anticipate problems, identify opportunities, and develop more robust strategies. Mental simulation is particularly valuable for preparing for high-stakes situations. Athletes use mental simulation to practice performance under pressure. Negotiators use it to anticipate the other party's responses to different tactics. Leaders use it to think through how their decisions might ripple through their organizations. The key to using mental models effectively is developing what Charlie Munger calls a latticework of models. No single mental model is sufficient for understanding complex situations. You need multiple models that complement and reinforce each other. When you encounter a challenging situation, you don't just apply one mental model. You apply several different models and look for insights that emerge from the intersection. Where multiple models point in the same direction, you can have higher confidence. Where they point in different directions, you know you need to dig deeper. The most powerful mental models are ones that apply across multiple domains. These include concepts like network effects, economies of scale, opportunity cost, margin of safety, and regression to the mean. When you truly understand these models, you start seeing their patterns everywhere, which dramatically improves your ability to navigate complex situations. Chapter 5. First Principles Thinking Revolution. Most people think by analogy. They encounter a new situation and immediately ask, "What does this remind me of?" Then they apply solutions that worked in similar situations. This analogical thinking is efficient and often effective, but it also keeps you trapped within the boundaries of existing solutions and conventional approaches. First principles thinking represents a completely different approach. Instead of reasoning by analogy, you break down complex problems into their most fundamental components and build up solutions from there. It's the difference between copying what others have done and deriving solutions from basic truths and foundational laws. This approach was pioneered by ancient philosophers, refined by scientists like Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, and has been applied by modern innovators like Elon Musk to create breakthrough solutions in industries that seemed mature and unchangeable. First principles thinking doesn't just help you solve problems better. It helps you solve problems that others can't even see. The power of first principles thinking lies in its ability to reveal hidden assumptions and artificial constraints. Most problems come with invisible boundaries created by conventional wisdom, industry practices, or historical precedents. When you reason by analogy, you inherit these constraints without even recognizing them. When you reason from first principles, you question everything and often discover that many apparent limitations are actually arbitrary restrictions. Consider how Elon Musk approached the problem of space transportation costs. The conventional wisdom was that rockets are inherently expensive because they've always been expensive. By reasoning from analogy, you would look at existing rocket designs and try to make incremental improvements to reduce costs slightly. But Musk applied first principles thinking. He asked, what is a rocket really? What are the fundamental materials and energy requirements? What are the basic physical laws that govern rocket propulsion? This analysis revealed that the raw materials in a rocket should cost only a small fraction of traditional rocket prices. The key insight was that rockets were expensive not because of fundamental physical limitations, but because of design choices and business model assumptions. Traditional rockets were designed to be expendable because that's how they'd always been built. But there's no fundamental physical law requiring rockets to be thrown away after one use. This first principles analysis led to the development of reusable rockets, which dramatically reduced launch costs and opened up entirely new possibilities for space exploration and commercial space activities. The breakthrough wasn't technical. It was conceptual. It came from questioning assumptions that everyone else took for granted. The first step in first principles thinking is identifying and questioning your assumptions. Most problems come preloaded with assumptions about what's possible, what's required, and what approaches might work. These assumptions are often so deeply embedded that you don't even recognize them as assumptions. They just seem like facts about the nature of the problem. To surface these hidden assumptions, you need to constantly ask, why? And what if this weren't true? For every constraint or requirement in your problem, ask whether it's a fundamental law of nature or an arbitrary human convention. Most constraints turn out to be conventions. For example, if you're trying to improve education, you might assume that learning requires students to sit in classrooms, listen to lectures, and take tests. But these are conventions, not fundamental requirements for learning. When you question these assumptions, you open up possibilities for completely different educational approaches. The second step is breaking down complex problems into their fundamental components. This requires identifying the basic elements, relationships, and principles that actually govern the situation, rather than focusing on surface features or traditional categories. This decomposition process often reveals that problems which seem completely different are actually variations of the same underlying challenge, or that problems which seem similar are actually fundamentally different in ways that require completely different approaches. Take the problem of traffic congestion. Traditional thinking focuses on building more roads or improving traffic flow. But first principles analysis might reveal that the fundamental issue is the inefficient use of space and time in transportation systems. This could lead to solutions involving shared autonomous vehicles, dynamic routing, or alternative transportation modes that don't require individual car ownership. The third step is rebuilding solutions from the ground up, using only the fundamental components and principles you've identified. This is where first principles thinking becomes creative and generative. You're not just analyzing existing solutions. You're constructing new possibilities from basic building blocks. This reconstruction process often leads to solutions that seem obvious in retrospect, but were invisible before because they violated conventional assumptions. The key is to remain open to possibilities that might seem impractical or impossible at first glance. One of the most powerful applications of first principles thinking is in business model innovation. Most businesses operate within industry conventions about how value is created, delivered, and captured. But these conventions are often arbitrary and can be reimagined from first principles. Netflix applied first principles thinking to entertainment distribution. Instead of accepting the conventional model of physical media rental, they asked, what do customers actually want? What are the fundamental requirements for delivering entertainment value? This led to mail-based DVD rental, then streaming, then original content production, each step representing a first principles reimagining of entertainment delivery. Amazon applied similar thinking to retail. Instead of accepting conventional assumptions about the need for physical stores, inventory management, and local market focus, they asked, what are customers actually trying to accomplish when they shop? What are the fundamental requirements for commerce? This led to innovations in online retail, logistics, cloud services, and artificial intelligence. First principles thinking is particularly powerful for personal development and career strategy. Most people make career decisions based on conventional paths and social expectations. They choose majors based on what seems practical, take jobs based on what's available, and develop skills based on what employers currently value. But first principles career thinking asks different questions. What problems do I find genuinely interesting and important? What are my fundamental strengths and energy sources? What types of value creation align with who I am at a deep level? What would I work on if conventional career constraints didn't exist? This approach often reveals career possibilities that aren't represented in traditional job categories or educational programs. It might lead you to create entirely new roles, combine skills from different fields in novel ways, or build businesses around problems that others haven't recognized yet. First principles thinking also transforms how you approach personal challenges and life decisions. Instead of accepting conventional wisdom about relationships, health, productivity, or happiness, you can examine these areas from fundamental principles. For health, instead of following the latest diet trends, you might ask, what does my body actually need to function optimally? What are the fundamental principles of human metabolism, sleep, stress management, and physical conditioning? This could lead to highly personalized approaches that work better than generic solutions. For productivity, instead of adopting popular productivity systems, you might ask, what am I actually trying to accomplish? What are the fundamental requirements for sustained creative work? How does my brain actually work? And what conditions optimize my performance? This might lead to customized approaches that fit your specific situation better than one-size-fits-all methodologies. However, first principles thinking isn't always the right approach. It requires significant time and mental energy, and it's not necessary for every decision. You should use first principles thinking for important, complex, or novel situations where conventional approaches aren't working or where breakthrough solutions could create significant value. For routine decisions or well-understood problems, analogical thinking is often more efficient and appropriate. The key is knowing when to apply which approach and having the cognitive flexibility to shift between different thinking modes as situations require. First principles thinking also requires intellectual courage. When you question fundamental assumptions and propose solutions that violate conventional wisdom, you'll often face skepticism and resistance. People are comfortable with familiar approaches, even when they're not working well. This resistance isn't just external, it's internal too. Your own brain will resist first principles thinking because it requires more effort and creates more uncertainty than analogical thinking. You'll need to develop tolerance for ambiguity and confidence in your ability to reason through complex problems from scratch. The ultimate goal of first principles thinking isn't to reject all conventional wisdom or to reinvent everything from scratch. It's to develop the ability to distinguish between fundamental truths and arbitrary conventions, so you can leverage what actually works while remaining free to innovate where innovation is needed. When you master first principles thinking, you develop what could be called conceptual independence. You're no longer limited by other people's assumptions about what's possible or necessary. You can see problems clearly and construct solutions that fit the actual requirements of situations rather than the inherited assumptions about how things should be done. This conceptual independence is one of the most valuable capabilities you can develop in a rapidly changing world where many conventional approaches are becoming obsolete and new challenges require fresh thinking approaches. Chapter 6. Mastering Decision Making Under Pressure. The quality of your life is determined by the quality of your decisions. But most people make their worst decisions precisely when the stakes are highest. When pressure mounts, deadlines loom, or conflicts arise, the cognitive systems responsible for strategic thinking get hijacked by primitive survival mechanisms designed for physical threats, not complex modern challenges. Understanding how pressure affects your brain is the first step in maintaining decision-making quality under stress. When you perceive a threat or urgent deadline, your nervous system releases stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals narrow your attention, impair working memory, and shift your brain into reactive mode rather than reflective mode. This stress response was adaptive when our ancestors faced immediate physical dangers, but it's counterproductive for modern challenges that require careful analysis and creative problem-solving. The same physiological state that helps you run from a predator will sabotage your ability to navigate a complex negotiation or make a strategic business decision. The first technique for maintaining decision quality under pressure is stress inoculation. This involves deliberately practicing decision-making in high-pressure situations, so your brain learns to maintain cognitive function despite stress. Military units, emergency responders, and elite athletes all use variations of stress inoculation training. You can apply this principle by creating artificial pressure when practicing important skills. If you need to give presentations under pressure, practice your presentations while doing physical exercise or under time constraints. If you need to make financial decisions under stress, practice with simulated scenarios that include emotional pressure and time limits. The key is gradually increasing the pressure in controlled environments, so your brain develops the neural pathways needed to maintain cognitive function under stress. This isn't about becoming immune to stress. It's about training your brain to access analytical thinking, even when your nervous system is activated. Another crucial technique is implementing decision-making protocols. These are predetermined frameworks that guide your thinking process when your natural cognitive abilities are compromised by pressure. Having a systematic approach reduces the cognitive load of deciding how to think about a problem, allowing you to focus your limited mental resources on the actual analysis. One powerful protocol is the OODA loop, developed by military strategist John Boyd. OODA stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. Under pressure, you systematically observe the situation. Orient yourself by understanding the context and your objectives. Decide on a course of action and act decisively while remaining ready to restart the cycle as conditions change. This framework prevents you from rushing into action without adequate analysis, while also preventing you from getting stuck in analysis paralysis. It provides structure for thinking under pressure, while maintaining the flexibility to adapt as situations evolve. For complex decisions under pressure, use the rapid decision-making matrix. List your main options. Identify the 3 most important criteria for evaluating those options, and quickly score each option on each criterion. This forces you to be explicit about your priorities and provides a structured way to compare alternatives even when you don't have time for exhaustive analysis. The matrix prevents you from being overwhelmed by complexity while ensuring that you consider multiple factors rather than making decisions based on the most salient or emotionally compelling single factor. Temporal thinking becomes especially important under pressure. When you feel rushed, your natural tendency is to focus entirely on immediate consequences while ignoring long-term implications. This leads to decisions that solve immediate problems but create bigger problems later. Counter this by implementing the 10-10-10 rule. For any significant decision under pressure, quickly consider how you'll feel about each option in 10 minutes, 10 months, and 10 years. This forces you to maintain temporal perspective even when immediate pressures are screaming for attention. Sometimes the pressure itself is artificial or self-imposed. Many urgent decisions aren't actually urgent when examined carefully. Before accepting time pressure as real, ask whether the deadline is truly fixed or whether it's possible to buy more time for better analysis. Often, spending a small amount of time negotiating for more decision time will dramatically improve the quality of your eventual decision. The key is distinguishing between real deadlines that can't be moved and artificial deadlines that exist primarily to create pressure. When deadlines are truly fixed, focus on making good enough decisions rather than perfect decisions. The enemy of good decisions under pressure isn't imperfection, it's perfectionism. Perfectionism leads to analysis paralysis, missed deadlines, and default outcomes that are worse than any conscious choice you could have made. Good enough decision-making requires identifying the minimum viable criteria for an acceptable decision and choosing the first option that meets those criteria rather than continuing to search for the theoretically optimal solution. Another critical skill is recognizing when to defer decisions. Not every urgent request requires an immediate decision. Sometimes the best response to pressure is to clearly communicate when you'll make the decision and what information you need to make it well. This approach often reveals that many supposedly urgent decisions become irrelevant if you wait, or that better options become available once the artificial urgency subsides. Strategic thinkers understand that declining to make premature decisions is itself a form of decision-making. Chapter 7. Pattern, Recognition, and Strategic Anticipation. The ability to recognize patterns before they become obvious to others is perhaps the most valuable skill in strategic thinking. Expert practitioners in every field, from chess grandmasters to successful investors to skilled diagnosticians, share this capacity to see meaningful patterns in apparent complexity and use those patterns to anticipate future developments. Pattern recognition operates at multiple levels simultaneously. At the surface level, you notice recurring sequences of events, similar configurations of factors, or familiar dynamics playing out in new contexts. At deeper levels, you recognize the underlying structures, incentives, and forces that generate these surface patterns. The most powerful pattern recognition combines both specific domain expertise and general principles that transfer across different areas. When you understand both the particular patterns of your specific field and the universal patterns that appear everywhere, you develop what could be called meta-pattern recognition, the ability to see patterns in how patterns form and evolve. Developing pattern recognition begins with systematic observation and memory cultivation. Most people observe their environment passively, noticing only what directly affects them or what's obviously dramatic. Strategic pattern recognition requires active, structured observation, where you deliberately look for connections, cycles, and recurring themes. Start by identifying the key variables in your domain and tracking how they change over time. If you're interested in business patterns, you might track economic indicators, consumer behavior trends, technology adoption cycles, and competitive dynamics. If you're focused on personal relationships, you might observe communication patterns, conflict cycles, trust-building sequences, and emotional rhythms. The key is moving beyond anecdotal observation to systematic data collection. Keep records of what you observe. Look for recurring themes across different time periods and contexts, and test your pattern hypotheses against subsequent events. Historical analysis provides the foundation for pattern recognition. Current events always feel unique and unprecedented, but most seemingly novel situations are variations of patterns that have played out many times before in different contexts. Studying history helps you recognize these deeper patterns and avoid being misled by surface differences. For business strategy, study how previous companies have responded to technological disruption, economic cycles, and competitive threats. For personal development, study how others have navigated career transitions, relationship challenges, and major life changes. For social and political understanding, study how societies have dealt with similar pressures and conflicts throughout history. The goal isn't to assume that history repeats exactly, but to understand the underlying dynamics that tend to recur in different forms. As Mark Twain supposedly said, "History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes." Leading indicators are early signals that suggest larger patterns are beginning to unfold. These are changes that occur before the main trend becomes visible to most observers. Identifying reliable leading indicators gives you significant strategic advantages because you can position yourself advantageously before the broader pattern becomes apparent. In economic contexts, leading indicators might include changes in credit conditions, early shifts in consumer sentiment, or emerging technologies that could disrupt existing business models. In organizational contexts, Leading indicators might include changes in key personnel, shifts in resource allocation, or early customer feedback on new initiatives. The challenge with leading indicators is distinguishing meaningful signals from random noise. Not every early change represents the beginning of a larger pattern. Developing reliable pattern recognition requires calibrating your sensitivity to avoid both missing important signals and being distracted by false alarms. Scenario planning enhances pattern recognition by forcing you to think through how different combinations of factors might interact to create various future outcomes. Instead of trying to predict one specific future, you develop multiple plausible scenarios and identify the early warning signs that would suggest each scenario is becoming more likely. This approach helps you recognize patterns as they're emerging rather than only after they're fully established. You become more sensitive to early signals because you've already thought through what those signals might indicate. For each scenario, identify the key variables that would drive that outcome and the early indicators that would suggest those variables are changing in the predicted direction. Then monitor those indicators systematically and update your scenario probabilities as new information becomes available. Cross-domain pattern recognition involves identifying structural similarities between apparently different fields. The same underlying patterns often appear in business, biology, psychology, physics, and social systems. When you recognize these cross-domain patterns, you can transfer insights from areas where patterns are well understood to areas where they're just beginning to emerge. For example, network effects appear in technology platforms, social movements, ecosystem development, and immune system responses. Understanding how network effects work in one domain helps you recognize and anticipate them in other domains. Viral spread patterns appear in infectious diseases, social media content, innovation adoption, and financial contagion. The mathematical models that describe viral spread in epidemiology can provide insights into how ideas, technologies, or market panics might spread through social and economic networks. Anti-fragility patterns appear in biological systems, technological development, and organizational design. Systems that become stronger under stress, rather than merely surviving it. Recognizing anti-fragile patterns helps you design strategies that benefit from uncertainty and volatility rather than just defending against them. Cycle recognition is particularly valuable for timing decisions and managing resources. Many patterns are cyclical, repeating with relatively predictable rhythms. Economic cycles, fashion cycles, political cycles, and personal energy cycles all follow recognizable patterns that can inform strategic timing. The key insight about cycles is that their emotional and psychological components are often more predictable than their specific technical details. Even when you can't predict exactly when a market cycle will turn, you can often recognize when sentiment has reached unsustainable extremes that typically precede reversals. Pattern degradation is equally important to recognize. Patterns that have been reliable in the past don't necessarily remain reliable forever. Changes in underlying conditions can make previously predictive patterns less useful or even misleading. Technology disruption often works by breaking patterns that seemed permanent. The rise of digital photography eliminated patterns that had governed the film industry for decades. Social media transformed communication patterns that had been stable for generations. Stay alert for signs that your recognized patterns might be losing their predictive power. When established patterns start producing unexpected results, it's often a signal that underlying conditions have changed and new patterns are emerging. Chapter 8. Advanced Problem Decomposition Techniques. Complex problems often feel overwhelming because your brain perceives them as single, massive challenges rather than collections of smaller, manageable components. Advanced problem decomposition transforms seemingly impossible challenges into systematic workflows where each component can be understood, analyzed, and addressed individually. The fundamental insight behind effective decomposition is that complexity is often an illusion created by interconnection rather than inherent difficulty. Most complex problems consist of multiple simple problems that interact with each other. When you try to solve everything simultaneously, the interactions create confusion and paralysis. When you decompose effectively, you can address each component systematically while managing the interactions explicitly. Structural decomposition begins by identifying the core components of your problem and understanding how they relate to each other. This requires moving beyond surface descriptions to understand the underlying architecture of the challenge you're facing. Start by asking, what are the main subsystems or categories within this problem? For a business challenge, these might be market factors, internal capabilities, competitive dynamics, regulatory constraints, and financial requirements. For a personal challenge, these might be skills, gaps, resource limitations, emotional barriers, time constraints, and relationship factors. Once you've identified the main components, map the relationships between them. Which components influence which others? Where are the feedback loops? Which relationships are causal versus correlational? This relationship mapping often reveals that what seemed like one complex problem is actually several simpler problems with well-defined interaction patterns. Functional decomposition focuses on breaking down problems by the different functions or processes involved. Instead of asking what the problem consists of, you ask what needs to happen to solve it. This approach is particularly powerful for operational challenges where you need to design or improve complex workflows. For each major function, identify the inputs required, the transformation that needs to occur, and the outputs that should result. Then break down each function into sub-functions until you reach a level where each component is clearly actionable. This approach often reveals hidden dependencies and resource requirements that weren't obvious when viewing the problem holistically. It also helps you identify which functions are critical path activities that could bottleneck your entire solution if not addressed adequately. Temporal decomposition involves breaking problems down by time horizons and sequencing. Many problems feel overwhelming because they mix immediate, urgent issues with long-term strategic challenges. Separating these temporal layers allows you to address each layer with appropriate tools and timelines. Identify which aspects of your problem need immediate attention, which require medium-term development, and which involve long-term positioning. Create separate work streams for each time horizon while maintaining coordination between them. This temporal separation often reveals that some seemingly urgent issues are actually symptoms of long-term problems that require strategic solutions, while some seemingly strategic issues have immediate implications that need tactical responses. Constraint-based decomposition focuses on identifying and categorizing the different types of limitations you're facing. Constraints often interact in complex ways, making problems seem more difficult than they actually are. When you identify and categorize constraints explicitly, you can often find ways to address them systematically or work around them creatively. Theory of constraints analysis helps you identify which constraint is currently limiting your progress most severely. Once you address the primary constraint, a different constraint typically becomes the limiting factor. This approach prevents you from wasting effort on improvements that won't actually increase your overall performance. Some constraints are immutable facts of nature or law that you must accept and work around. Others are resource limitations that could be addressed with sufficient investment. Still others are self-imposed restrictions based on assumptions that could be questioned or beliefs that could be changed. Stakeholder decomposition involves identifying all the different people or groups who influence or are influenced by your problem. Complex problems often remain unsolved because solution attempts ignore important stakeholders or fail to understand their different perspectives and incentives. Map out all the stakeholders. Understand their interests and concerns. Identify potential conflicts between different stakeholder groups and design solutions that address the legitimate needs of all important parties. This stakeholder analysis often reveals that technical solutions fail not because they don't work, but because they don't account for the human and political dynamics surrounding the problem. Root cause decomposition uses systematic analysis to identify the fundamental drivers behind surface problems. Most visible problems are symptoms of deeper issues. Addressing symptoms provides temporary relief, but doesn't prevent the problem from recurring. The 5 whys technique involves asking why repeatedly to drill down from surface symptoms to root causes. When you encounter a problem, ask why it happened. Then ask why that underlying cause happened. Continue this process until you reach causes that are truly fundamental rather than themselves symptoms of deeper issues. Fishbone diagrams provide a more structured approach to root cause analysis. Draw the problem as the head of a fish, then identify major categories of potential causes as the main bones. For each category, identify specific potential causes as smaller bones. This visual approach helps ensure you consider all potential cause categories rather than focusing only on the most obvious possibilities. Dependency decomposition focuses on understanding how different elements of your problem depend on each other. Some components can be addressed independently, while others require specific sequencing or coordination. Create a dependency map showing which problem components must be completed before others can begin, which can be worked on in parallel, and which have complex interdependencies that require careful coordination. This dependency analysis often reveals that problems which seem to require simultaneous progress on all fronts actually have logical sequences where early progress creates the foundation for later breakthroughs. Value chain decomposition breaks problems down according to the sequence of value-creating activities involved. This approach is particularly useful for business problems, but can be applied to any situation where you're trying to create value or achieve outcomes through a series of connected activities. Map out each step in your value creation process. Identify where value is currently being created or destroyed. Look for bottlenecks or inefficiencies in the chain, and design improvements that optimize the entire system rather than just individual components. Chapter 9. Emotional intelligence in strategic thinking. Strategic thinking isn't purely rational. Emotions provide crucial information about values, priorities, and potential outcomes that purely logical analysis might miss. The key is learning to integrate emotional intelligence with analytical thinking rather than viewing them as opposing forces. Emotional intelligence in strategic contexts involves four main capabilities: emotional awareness, emotional regulation, social awareness, and relationship management. Each of these capabilities enhances your ability to think strategically by providing additional sources of information and influence. Emotional awareness begins with recognizing your own emotional responses to different situations and understanding what those emotions are telling you. Emotions aren't just random internal weather. They're information processing systems that evaluate situations according to your deep values and past experiences. Fear often signals potential threats or risks that your analytical mind might have overlooked. Excitement might indicate opportunities that align with your core motivations. Frustration might reveal conflicts between your current approach and your underlying values or goals. The key is learning to decode these emotional signals rather than either ignoring them or being controlled by them. When you notice strong emotional reactions to strategic decisions, pause and ask what information these emotions might be providing about the situation. Sometimes emotional reactions reveal unstated assumptions or hidden concerns that need to be addressed explicitly. Other times they indicate value conflicts that require conscious resolution. Occasionally, they signal pattern recognition happening below conscious awareness that deserves further analytical investigation. Emotional regulation in strategic contexts doesn't mean suppressing emotions or making purely rational decisions. It means managing your emotional state so that emotions inform your thinking without overwhelming your analytical capabilities. When facing high-stakes decisions, your emotional state affects your cognitive abilities, risk assessment, creativity, and ability to consider multiple perspectives. Learning to regulate your emotional state is therefore a cognitive performance strategy, not just a personal wellness practice. Techniques for emotional regulation include cognitive reappraisal, where you consciously reframe challenging situations in ways that promote more effective emotional responses. Instead of viewing setbacks as failures, you can reframe them as learning opportunities. Instead of viewing competition as threats, you can reframe them as benchmarks for improvement. Physical regulation techniques like controlled breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, and mindfulness meditation can help restore cognitive function when emotional arousal is interfering with clear thinking. Temporal regulation involves adjusting your time perspective to reduce emotional intensity. When you're feeling overwhelmed by immediate pressures, expanding your time horizon to consider how current challenges fit into longer-term patterns can reduce emotional reactivity and restore strategic perspective. Social awareness involves reading the emotional states and motivations of other people involved in your strategic situation. Other people's emotions provide valuable information about their priorities, concerns, and likely responses to different approaches. This social emotional intelligence helps you predict how others will respond to your strategic initiatives, identify potential sources of resistance or support, and design approaches that work with human psychology rather than against it. Pay attention to incongruence between what people say and how they feel. Words can be controlled consciously, but emotional expressions are harder to fake. When someone's emotional signals contradict their verbal statements, the emotions usually provide more accurate information about their true position. Look for emotional patterns in groups and organizations. Collective emotions like excitement, anxiety, confidence, or resignation affect how groups process information and make decisions. Understanding these collective emotional states helps you time initiatives appropriately and frame communications effectively. Relationship management involves using emotional intelligence to influence and coordinate with others in pursuit of strategic objectives. This isn't manipulation. It's skillful communication that acknowledges the emotional dimensions of human interaction. Building trust requires emotional consistency and reliability over time. People need to feel that you understand their concerns and interests, not just that you can present logical arguments. Strategic initiatives often fail, not because they're analytically flawed, but because they don't address the emotional needs of key stakeholders. Influence through emotional intelligence involves connecting your strategic objectives with other people's emotional motivations. Instead of just presenting logical reasons why people should support your approach, help them see how your approach serves their emotional needs for security, recognition, growth, or contribution. Conflict resolution often requires addressing emotional dynamics before logical negotiations can be productive. When people feel misunderstood or disrespected, they're unlikely to engage in good-faith analytical discussions of strategic options. Emotional intelligence also enhances your ability to learn from experience. Strong emotions often mark significant learning opportunities. Situations that generate intense emotions usually involve important values, unexpected outcomes, or conflicts between different mental models. Instead of just moving past emotionally charged experiences, use them as learning laboratories. What triggered the strong emotions? What values or expectations were involved? What does this reveal about your assumptions or blind spots? How might you approach similar situations differently in the future? Creating emotional learning loops where you systematically extract strategic insights from emotionally significant experiences can dramatically accelerate your development as a strategic thinker. Intuition deserves special attention in strategic thinking. Intuitive judgments aren't magical. They're rapid processing of complex patterns by unconscious mental systems. These systems can sometimes detect patterns and relationships that conscious analysis misses, especially in domains where you have extensive experience. The key is learning to distinguish between reliable intuitive insights and emotional biases or wishful thinking. Reliable intuition usually feels calm and clear, while emotional bias feels charged and reactive. Test your intuitive insights through systematic analysis when possible, but don't dismiss them when analysis is inconclusive. Sometimes intuitive pattern recognition provides early warning signals about complex situations that logical analysis will only confirm later. Chapter 10. Building adaptable intelligence. In a rapidly changing world, rigid intelligence becomes a liability. The cognitive frameworks that served you well in stable environments can become obstacles when conditions shift fundamentally. Adaptable intelligence is the ability to update your thinking patterns, abandon ineffective approaches, and develop new capabilities as circumstances require. The foundation of adaptable intelligence is intellectual humility, the recognition that your current understanding is provisional and improvable. This doesn't mean lacking confidence in your judgments. It means holding your beliefs lightly enough that you can update them when better evidence becomes available. Most people suffer from various forms of cognitive rigidity that prevent adaptation. Confirmation bias causes you to seek information that supports your existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Sunk cost fallacy causes you to persist with failing approaches because you've already invested effort in them. Status quo bias makes change feel more risky than staying with familiar approaches. Overcoming these rigidities requires developing what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between different thinking modes and adjust your mental frameworks based on situational demands. Active belief updating is the practice of regularly examining your core assumptions and actively seeking evidence that might contradict them. Most people only update their beliefs when contradictory evidence becomes overwhelming. Adaptable thinkers update continuously based on small signals and weak evidence. This doesn't mean being wishy-washy or constantly changing your mind. It means maintaining appropriate uncertainty, calibrated to the strength of your evidence and the stability of the underlying conditions. Implement regular belief audits where you explicitly examine your assumptions about important areas of your life or work. Ask yourself, what evidence originally convinced me of this belief? What evidence would convince me that this belief might be wrong? Have I actively looked for such evidence recently? For beliefs that significantly influence your decisions, actively seek out intelligent people who disagree with you and genuinely try to understand their reasoning. This isn't about being convinced by every contrary argument, but about ensuring that your beliefs can withstand informed scrutiny. Mental model diversification involves developing multiple frameworks for understanding the same phenomena. Just as financial diversification reduces investment risk, cognitive diversification reduces the risk of being blindsided by changes that your primary mental models don't anticipate. Study how different disciplines approach similar problems. Economists, psychologists, biologists, physicists, and historians often have completely different frameworks for understanding complex systems. Each framework highlights different aspects of reality and suggests different intervention strategies. Practice switching between different mental models when analyzing the same situation. How would an economist analyze this challenge? How would a systems theorist approach it? What would a game theorist focus on? This multi-perspective analysis often reveals insights that single-framework thinking misses. Scenario-based thinking helps build adaptability by forcing you to consider how your strategies might need to change under different conditions. Instead of planning for one expected future, develop contingency plans for multiple possible futures. For each major strategic decision, identify the key assumptions underlying your approach and consider how your strategy would need to change if those assumptions proved incorrect. This scenario planning doesn't just prepare you for different futures. It also reveals the hidden assumptions in your current thinking. Learning velocity becomes crucial in rapidly changing environments. It's not enough to be able to learn. You need to be able to learn faster than the rate of change in your environment. This requires developing more efficient learning processes and being more selective about what you choose to learn. Focus your learning efforts on meta skills that transfer across domains rather than just domain-specific knowledge. Critical thinking, pattern recognition, communication skills, and learning how to learn are examples of meta skills that remain valuable even when specific technical knowledge becomes obsolete. Develop rapid experimentation capabilities that allow you to test new approaches quickly and cheaply before committing significant resources. This experimental mindset treats your strategies as hypotheses to be tested rather than plans to be executed regardless of feedback. Feedback loop optimization involves designing better systems for detecting when your approaches aren't working and need adjustment. Many people get stuck with ineffective strategies because they don't have reliable mechanisms for detecting failure early. Create leading indicators that signal when your strategies are working or failing before the ultimate outcomes become clear. Identify the key metrics that would change first if your approach were failing, and monitor those metrics systematically. Build feedback systems that overcome your natural cognitive biases. Since you're psychologically motivated to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting your existing approaches, design objective measurement systems that provide clear signals about performance. Anti-fragile design principles help you build strategies that become stronger under stress rather than just surviving stress. Instead of just defending against potential problems, look for ways to benefit from volatility and uncertainty. Develop strategies with optionality built in. Approaches that provide upside potential while limiting downside risk. Maintain diversity in your approaches so that some can benefit when others are struggling. Build redundancy and backup systems so that individual failures don't create systemic collapse. Network-based learning leverages other people's insights and experiences to accelerate your own adaptation. No individual can learn fast enough to keep up with exponential change, but networks of people can process information and develop insights much more rapidly than individuals. Cultivate relationships with people who have different perspectives, expertise, and information sources than you do. Create information-sharing relationships where you can learn from other people's experiments and experiences without having to repeat all their mistakes yourself. The ultimate goal of adaptable intelligence isn't to become someone who changes constantly, but to become someone who changes appropriately. Maintaining stability in your core values and long-term objectives while remaining flexible in your methods and short-term tactics. Chapter 11. Advanced Influence and Persuasion Strategies. True strategic influence isn't about manipulation or coercion. It's about understanding human psychology deeply enough that you can present ideas in ways that resonate with how people naturally think and make decisions. The most powerful influencers don't force people to change their minds. They create conditions where people naturally arrive at better conclusions. The foundation of strategic influence is understanding that people don't make decisions based purely on logic. They make decisions based on a complex interaction of emotions, social pressures, cognitive shortcuts, and rational analysis. When you understand these decision-making processes, you can present information in ways that align with, rather than fight, against natural human psychology. Reciprocity is one of the most powerful influence principles. People feel psychologically obligated to return favors and positive gestures. But strategic reciprocity isn't about keeping score or manipulating people into debt. It's about creating genuine value for others as a foundation for mutually beneficial relationships. The key insight is that the reciprocity principle is triggered more by the thoughtfulness of gestures than by their monetary value. A small favor that demonstrates understanding of someone's specific needs creates more psychological obligation than an expensive but generic gift. Strategic reciprocity involves identifying what others truly value and finding ways to provide that value before asking for anything in return. This might be information, connections, recognition, or simply thoughtful attention to their concerns and interests. Social proof leverages people's tendency to look to others for guidance about appropriate behavior. When people are uncertain about what to do, they observe what others are doing and follow similar patterns. This tendency is strongest when the other people are similar to them or when the situation is ambiguous. Strategic use of social proof involves highlighting examples of people that your audience identifies with who have already adopted the behavior or belief you're promoting. Instead of just presenting logical arguments, you show that reasonable people like them have already reached similar conclusions. The power of social proof is amplified when you can demonstrate that the trend is growing. People want to be part of emerging movements rather than declining ones. Showing momentum and increasing adoption creates psychological pressure to join rather than be left behind. Commitment and consistency leverage people's desire to appear consistent with their previous statements and behaviors. Once people take a public position or make a commitment, they feel psychological pressure to behave in ways that align with that commitment. Strategic commitment building involves getting people to articulate their own reasons for adopting your position, rather than just presenting your reasons to them. When people generate their own arguments, they become psychologically invested in those arguments in ways that external persuasion can't achieve. Small initial commitments often lead to larger commitments later. People who agree to small requests become more likely to agree to larger related requests because they develop a self-image as someone who supports that type of activity. Framing effects demonstrate that how information is presented often matters more than what information is presented. The same facts can lead to completely different decisions depending on how they're framed and what comparisons are highlighted. Strategic framing involves presenting information in contexts that lead to the conclusions you want people to reach. This isn't about deception. It's about choosing truthful presentations that emphasize the most relevant aspects of complex situations. Loss framing tends to be more motivating than gain framing for risk-averse decisions. People are more motivated to avoid losing something they already have than to gain something new. When presenting change initiatives, emphasize what people risk losing by not changing rather than just what they might gain by changing. Anchoring effects show that initial reference points heavily influence subsequent judgments. The first number people hear in a negotiation, the first option they consider, or the first interpretation they encounter, all serve as anchors that bias later thinking. Strategic anchoring involves carefully controlling what reference points you establish early in conversations. In negotiations, this might mean making the first offer to set a favorable anchor. In presentations, this might mean establishing ambitious goals early to make more modest requests seem reasonable by comparison. Authority and expertise influence work because people defer to perceived experts, especially in areas where they lack confidence in their own judgment. But authority isn't just about credentials. It's about demonstrating competence and trustworthiness. In specific contexts, building strategic authority requires establishing credibility through demonstrated expertise rather than just claimed expertise. This means sharing insights that others find valuable, making accurate predictions, and acknowledging the limits of your knowledge in areas outside your expertise. The most persuasive authority combines competence with humility. People trust experts who are confident about what they know, but honest about what they don't know. This honesty actually increases rather than decreases persuasive power, because it signals trustworthiness. Scarcity and urgency can motivate action, but they must be genuine to be effective long-term. False scarcity or artificial urgency often backfire when people discover the manipulation. Real scarcity, however, can help people overcome procrastination and analysis paralysis. Strategic scarcity focuses on unique value propositions that genuinely can't be obtained elsewhere, rather than artificial time limits. Instead of creating false urgency, help people understand the opportunity costs of delay and the genuine risks of inaction. Chapter 12. Systems Thinking and Leverage Points. Most people approach problems by focusing on events and symptoms while ignoring the underlying systems that generate those problems. Systems thinking involves understanding the structures, relationships, and feedback loops that create the patterns you observe in complex situations. The fundamental insight of systems thinking is that behavior is generated by structure. When you see recurring problems or persistent patterns, the root cause usually lies in the system's design rather than in the individual actors within the system. Changing individual behavior without changing systems typically leads to temporary improvements that revert to previous patterns. Systems are characterized by several key properties. They consist of elements that are connected through relationships and organized around a purpose. The relationships between elements are often more important than the elements themselves. Systems exhibit emergent properties that arise from interactions rather than from individual components. Understanding feedback loops is central to systems thinking. Reinforcing feedback loops amplify changes, creating exponential growth or decline. When success leads to more resources, which leads to more success, that's a reinforcing loop. When problems create stress, which leads to poor decisions, which creates more problems, that's also reinforcing feedback, but in a destructive direction. Balancing feedback loops creates stability by counteracting changes. When market prices rise, demand decreases, which causes prices to fall back down. When you feel cold, you shiver to generate heat, which warms you up and reduces shivering. These balancing loops prevent systems from growing indefinitely or collapsing completely. Most complex systems contain multiple feedback loops operating simultaneously. Understanding which loops are dominant in different conditions helps you predict how systems will behave and identify where interventions might be most effective. Leverage points are places within systems where small changes can produce significant impacts. Systems theorist Donella Meadows identified a hierarchy of leverage points, from least effective to most effective ways to intervene in systems. The lowest leverage interventions involve changing numbers within systems. Adjusting budgets, targets, or performance metrics can influence behavior, but they don't change the underlying structure that generates behavior patterns. These interventions often fail because the system's structure eventually overwhelms attempts to change through numerical adjustments alone. Higher leverage comes from changing the elements within systems. Replacing key personnel, introducing new technology, or modifying organizational components can shift system behavior. These interventions are more effective than just changing numbers, but they still work within existing structural constraints. Even higher leverage comes from changing the connections within systems. Modifying information flows, decision-making authorities, or reporting relationships can dramatically alter how systems behave. Often, small changes in who talks to whom or who has access to what information can transform entire organizational dynamics. Changing the rules that govern systems provides very high leverage. Rules include policies, procedures, incentive structures, and formal constraints that shape behavior within systems. When you change the rules, you change the structure within which all other system elements operate. Changing the power to make rules represents even higher leverage. This involves shifting who has authority to establish policies, procedures, and structural elements. Constitutional changes, governance reforms, and power redistributions often have profound long-term impacts because they change how all subsequent rules get made. The highest leverage point is changing the paradigms or mindsets from which systems arise. Paradigms are the deeply held beliefs and assumptions that determine how people interpret reality and what they consider possible or desirable. When paradigms shift, entire systems restructure themselves around new organizing principles. Paradigm shifts are difficult to achieve because paradigms are largely unconscious and reinforced by existing systems. People within paradigms can't easily see their own paradigms because the paradigm shapes what they consider normal and reasonable. But paradigm shifts also offer the greatest potential for transformation because they change everything downstream. When scientific paradigms shift, entire research programs redirect. When business paradigms shift, entire industries restructure. When personal paradigms shift, entire life patterns change. Systems thinking also reveals the importance of unintended consequences. Complex systems often respond to interventions in ways that weren't anticipated because the interventions trigger feedback loops and adaptations throughout the system. Policy resistance occurs when systems push back against interventions. When you try to force a system to change, the system often develops countervailing forces that neutralize your efforts. This is why many well-intentioned policies fail or create opposite effects from what was intended. Understanding system structure helps you design interventions that work with system dynamics rather than against them. Instead of trying to overpower systems through force, you can identify natural leverage points where the system wants to change and focus your efforts there. Delays in feedback loops create additional complexity in systems. Actions often have consequences that don't appear until much later, making it difficult to learn from experience or adjust strategies appropriately. By the time you see the results of your actions, conditions may have changed significantly. These delays explain why many problems persist despite repeated attempts to solve them. People try solutions, don't see immediate results, conclude the solutions aren't working, and try different approaches before the original solutions have had time to take effect. Systems archetype patterns represent common structural problems that appear across many different contexts. Learning to recognize these patterns helps you diagnose system problems more quickly and apply proven intervention strategies. The fixes that fail archetype occurs when quick fixes temporarily improve symptoms but ultimately make underlying problems worse. The shifting the burden archetype occurs when people address symptoms rather than root causes, which weakens their capacity to solve fundamental problems. Understanding these archetypal patterns helps you avoid common system traps and design more effective long-term solutions. Chapter 13. Strategic Communication and Negotiation. Strategic communication isn't just about presenting information clearly. It's about understanding how different audiences process information, what motivates them to act, and how to structure interactions to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes, even when interests initially appear to conflict. The foundation of strategic communication is audience analysis. Before crafting any message, you need to understand who you're communicating with, what they care about, how they make decisions, and what constraints they're operating under. The same information presented to different audiences requires completely different approaches. Effective audience analysis goes beyond demographics to understand psychographics, decision-making processes, and situational contexts. What are their current beliefs and assumptions? What sources of information do they trust? What would motivate them to change their current approach? What barriers might prevent them from acting even if they're convinced? Understanding decision-making authority is crucial. Often, the person you're communicating with isn't the ultimate decision-maker, but they influence that decision-maker. Understanding this chain of influence helps you tailor your message to be effectively transmitted through multiple levels. Message structure significantly impacts comprehension and persuasion. The primacy effect means that information presented first has disproportionate influence on overall impressions. The recency effect means that information presented last is most easily remembered. Understanding these effects helps you structure communications for maximum impact. For complex messages, use the pyramid principle. Start with conclusions, then provide supporting arguments, then offer detailed evidence. This structure helps busy audiences understand your main points even if they don't have time to process all the details. For persuasive messages, consider the problem agitation solution structure. First, establish that a problem exists, then help the audience feel the costs of not solving it. Then present your solution as the most effective way to address the problem. Strategic storytelling leverages the human brain's natural tendency to think in narrative terms. Stories are more memorable than abstract arguments and create emotional engagement that pure logic can't achieve. But strategic stories aren't just entertainment. They're vehicles for conveying complex ideas in compelling ways. Effective strategic stories follow the hero's journey structure. A protagonist faces a challenge, struggles with obstacles, and ultimately succeeds through specific actions or insights. Your audience should be able to see themselves as the hero of the story, with your recommendations providing the insights they need to overcome their challenges. Use concrete details and specific examples rather than abstract generalizations. The human brain processes concrete information more easily than abstract concepts. When you're explaining complex strategies, ground them in specific scenarios that your audience can visualize. Negotiation represents communication under conditions of apparent conflict, where the goal is finding solutions that serve everyone's essential interests. The key insight is that most negotiations aren't truly zero-sum games where one person's gain requires another person's loss. Principled negotiation focuses on interests rather than positions. Positions are what people say they want. Interests are why they want it. Often, different positions can serve the same underlying interests, and understanding those interests reveals creative solutions that weren't apparent when focusing only on stated positions. Preparation is crucial for strategic negotiation. Before any important negotiation, research the other party's likely interests, constraints, and alternatives. Understand your own best alternative to a negotiated agreement, because this determines your bargaining power. Develop multiple options that could serve both parties' interests rather than just advocating for your preferred outcome. The more options you can generate, the more likely you are to find solutions that work for everyone. Separate people from problems by addressing relationship issues explicitly rather than letting them complicate substantive discussions. When people feel attacked or disrespected, they become focused on defending themselves rather than solving problems collaboratively. Use objective criteria to evaluate different options rather than relying purely on subjective preferences. When both parties can agree on fair standards for evaluation, negotiations become problem-solving exercises rather than contests of will. Active listening is perhaps the most important negotiation skill. Most people listen just enough to formulate their rebuttal, rather than truly understanding the other person's perspective. Strategic listeners ask questions to understand underlying concerns and repeat back what they've heard to confirm understanding. This approach often reveals that apparent conflicts are based on misunderstandings or that different parties are actually concerned about different aspects of the same situation and can find solutions that address everyone's primary concerns. Difficult conversations require special communication strategies because emotions run high and people's natural tendency is to avoid or mishandle them. The key is structuring these conversations to address both substantive issues and relationship dynamics simultaneously. Start difficult conversations by establishing shared purpose and mutual respect. Before diving into areas of disagreement, remind everyone involved what you're trying to accomplish together and affirm your respect for each other, even when you disagree about specific issues. Use I statements to express your perspective without attacking the other person's character or motives. Instead of saying, "You always interrupt me," say, "I feel frustrated when I'm interrupted because I lose my train of thought." Focus on specific behaviors and their impact, rather than making generalizations about the other person's character or intentions. This makes it easier for people to hear feedback and make changes without feeling personally attacked. Multi-stakeholder communication involves coordinating messages across multiple audiences who may have different interests and concerns. The challenge is maintaining consistency while adapting your approach to each audience's specific needs and perspectives. Develop a core message architecture that remains consistent across audiences while allowing for tactical adaptations in emphasis, examples, and supporting arguments. This ensures that different stakeholders hear consistent information while receiving it in ways that resonate with their specific concerns. Chapter 14. Long-term vision and strategic planning. Strategic planning isn't about predicting the future. It's about developing robust approaches that will work across multiple possible futures while positioning yourself to adapt as conditions change. The most effective strategic thinkers combine ambitious long-term vision with flexible short-term tactics. Vision development begins with understanding your core values and fundamental motivations. What do you care about deeply enough that you'd pursue it even if it were difficult or took a long time to achieve? What kind of impact do you want to have on the world? What legacy do you want to leave? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're practical foundations for strategic thinking. When you're clear about your fundamental values and long-term aspirations, you can make consistent decisions even when facing novel situations or unexpected opportunities. Effective visions are specific enough to provide direction but flexible enough to accommodate different paths for achievement. Instead of committing to particular tactics or specific timelines, focus on the outcomes you want to create and the principles that will guide your approach. Scenario planning helps bridge the gap between long-term vision and practical action by considering multiple ways the future might unfold. Instead of trying to predict one specific future, identify several plausible scenarios and develop strategies that would work across all of them. Start by identifying the key uncertainties that could significantly impact your strategic situation. These might involve technological developments, economic trends, regulatory changes, competitive dynamics, or social shifts. For each uncertainty, consider how it might evolve in ways that would help or hinder your strategic objectives. Develop 3 to 5 distinct scenarios that combine these uncertainties in different ways. One scenario might involve rapid technological change with economic growth. Another might involve slow technological change with economic stagnation, and another might involve regulatory shifts that change the competitive landscape. For each scenario, identify what strategies would work best and what early warning signals would suggest that scenario is becoming more likely. This scenario planning doesn't predict the future, but it prepares you to recognize changes early and adapt your approach accordingly. Strategic resource allocation involves making conscious choices about how to invest your time, attention, and energy to maximize long-term value creation. Not all opportunities are equally valuable, and not all problems deserve equal attention. Use the 80-20 principle to identify the small number of activities that create the majority of your results. Most people spread their efforts too widely, making progress on many fronts, but achieving breakthrough results on none. Focus your best resources on your highest leverage opportunities while maintaining adequate attention to essential maintenance activities. This might mean saying no to good opportunities so you can fully commit to great opportunities. Building strategic capabilities involves developing skills, relationships, and resources that will remain valuable across multiple scenarios and time horizons. Instead of just optimizing for current conditions, invest in capabilities that will provide options and advantages regardless of how conditions change. Meta skills like critical thinking, communication, learning ability, and relationship building tend to remain valuable even when specific technical skills become obsolete. Developing these meta skills provides insurance against future uncertainty. Strategic relationships with people who have complementary skills, different perspectives, or access to different opportunities create mutual value and expand your strategic options. These relationships need to be genuine and reciprocal rather than purely transactional. Building reputation and credibility in your chosen field creates compound advantages over time. Reputation attracts opportunities, resources, and collaborators that would be difficult to access otherwise. But reputation building requires consistent excellence over extended periods. Risk management in strategic planning involves preparing for potential problems without becoming paralyzed by them. Every strategy involves some risks, and the goal is to take intelligent risks while avoiding catastrophic ones. Identify potential failure modes for your strategic approach and develop contingency plans for the most significant risks. This isn't about planning for every possible problem, but about having prepared responses for the problems that could derail your entire strategy. Maintain adequate reserves and backup options so that individual setbacks don't force you to abandon your overall strategic direction. This might involve financial reserves, alternative approaches to key objectives, or relationships that could provide support during difficult periods. Implementation planning translates strategic vision into concrete actions and milestones. Without effective implementation, even brilliant strategies remain just ideas. The key is creating systematic approaches that maintain momentum while allowing for course corrections. Break long-term objectives into intermediate milestones that provide feedback about your progress and allow for strategy adjustments. These milestones should be significant enough to create real progress, but achievable enough to maintain motivation. Develop systematic review processes that regularly assess both your progress toward objectives and the continued validity of your underlying assumptions. Strategy isn't set and forget. It requires ongoing adaptation based on new information and changing conditions. Create accountability systems that help you maintain discipline in executing your strategic priorities even when day-to-day pressures create distractions. This might involve regular reviews with mentors, tracking systems that monitor key metrics, or public commitments that create external motivation. Chapter 15. Implementation and Mastery. Knowledge without implementation remains merely intellectual entertainment. The difference between people who understand strategic thinking concepts and people who achieve strategic thinking results lies entirely in their ability to consistently apply these principles in real-world situations. The implementation challenge is that strategic thinking requires overriding many of your brain's default patterns. Your brain evolved for immediate survival in simple environments, not for complex decision-making in uncertain conditions. This means that applying strategic thinking principles requires conscious effort and systematic practice until new thinking patterns become habitual. Start with one principle at a time, rather than trying to apply everything simultaneously. Choose the strategic thinking concept that seems most relevant to your current challenges and focus on applying it consistently for several weeks before adding additional principles. Deliberate practice is the key to developing mastery in strategic thinking. This means practicing these principles in increasingly challenging situations where the stakes gradually increase. Start with low-risk decisions where you can experiment with different approaches without serious consequences. Keep a decision journal where you record important decisions, the reasoning process you used, the principles you applied, and the outcomes that resulted. Review this journal regularly to identify patterns in your thinking and areas where you could improve your approach. Create implementation triggers that remind you to apply strategic thinking principles when they're most needed. These might be specific questions you ask yourself before important decisions, checklists you use for complex problems, or regular review processes that ensure you're thinking strategically about your priorities. Mental rehearsal accelerates the development of strategic thinking skills. Spend time imagining how you would apply these principles to hypothetical scenarios or past situations where you could have thought more strategically. This mental practice strengthens the neural pathways associated with strategic thinking. Find opportunities to teach these concepts to others. Teaching forces you to understand principles more deeply and provides practice in applying them to different situations. It also creates accountability for your own implementation of these principles. Build strategic thinking into your environment by surrounding yourself with people who think strategically and creating systems that support strategic decision-making. Your environment has enormous influence on your thinking patterns, so design it to reinforce the mental habits you want to develop. Measure progress by tracking the quality of your thinking process rather than just the outcomes of your decisions. Good strategic thinking improves your probability of good outcomes, but it doesn't guarantee them. Focus on whether you're consistently applying sound principles rather than whether every decision works out perfectly. Common implementation obstacles include perfectionism, which causes people to overanalyze decisions instead of taking action; emotional reactivity, which overrides strategic thinking when stress levels rise; and social pressure, which causes people to abandon strategic approaches when others pressure them to act differently. Overcome perfectionism by setting good enough standards for different types of decisions and committing to act once you reach those standards. Most decisions are reversible and can be improved through iteration rather than requiring perfect initial analysis. Manage emotional reactivity by recognizing your emotional triggers and having predetermined responses that help you restore strategic thinking when emotions run high. This might involve taking breaks before important decisions, consulting with trusted advisors, or using breathing techniques to reduce emotional arousal. Handle social pressure by being selective about whose opinions you consider when making strategic decisions. Not everyone in your life thinks strategically, and well-meaning advice from people who don't understand strategic thinking can undermine your decision-making quality. The ultimate goal isn't to become someone who thinks strategically sometimes, but to become someone for whom strategic thinking is the natural default approach to important challenges. This transformation happens gradually through consistent practice and application. Strategic thinking mastery is evidenced by several characteristics. You naturally consider multiple time horizons when making decisions. You automatically look for underlying patterns and systems rather than just reacting to surface events. You consistently seek information that might contradict your initial impressions. You approach problems by breaking them down systematically rather than jumping to solutions. You maintain appropriate confidence that's calibrated to the actual uncertainty in different situations. You influence others through understanding their perspectives rather than just asserting your own. You adapt your strategies when conditions change rather than stubbornly persisting with approaches that are no longer working. Most importantly, you take responsibility for the quality of your thinking rather than blaming circumstances when things don't work out as planned. You view every challenge as an opportunity to refine your strategic thinking abilities and every setback as feedback that can improve your future decision-making. The journey towards strategic thinking mastery is ongoing. The world continues to become more complex and fast-changing, which means that the ability to think strategically becomes increasingly valuable over time. The principles you've learned today will serve you throughout your life, but they'll also evolve and deepen as you apply them to new challenges and situations. Your brain now has the tools to outsmart virtually any situation you encounter. The question is whether you'll use them consistently enough to make strategic thinking your natural way of approaching the world. The choice, as always, is yours.